Welcome to another week in our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast. If you've been with us over the last several weeks, even a couple months, you know we've been going through the book of Job, and we've come to the end of Job's dialogue with his friends, and we're looking now at what God has to say, his response to Job. Also, if you've been reading through Job with us, you've noticed that Job has on numerous occasions called for a conference with God. Job seems to be convinced that if he could just sit down with God, present his case as in a court of law almost, then God would say, "Oh, okay, I see your point, Job. I have wronged you. I have apparently misunderstood you, and I'm going to make some changes." That seems to be Job's thinking. And although that seems a bit bizarre when we say it that way, because Job knows enough about God to know that God is all-knowing, God is all-powerful, God is sovereign. He's talked about that. He knows that, at least in his head. And so he knows that God does not need his words and his rebuttal to God himself. He knows that. And yet he's struggling with that. And I think, too, as we plug that back into our own lives, I wonder how many of our prayers are a little bit more like Job's than we think. How much of our prayer life, as we're going to God in prayer, especially if we're troubled about something, how much of those is that prayer time being spent explaining to God the situation, as if God didn't know? Have you ever heard somebody pray out loud and they're giving all the details that we know that God already knows, but we kind of act like he doesn't. And then we're talking about all the details that maybe God needs to know, and here's our argument, Lord, as to why you ought to change your mind about something you're doing in my life. And here's the explanation, God. I want to change your mind, God, into conformity with mine. Now, we don't like to think of it that way, but if we really would analyze our prayers, I fear that our prayers are more like that than we actually realize. So we're not that far from Job. Job is just being vocal. It's written in the Word. But our own personal lives can be there as well, especially our prayer life. So we don't want to be too hard on Job, but the Lord now is speaking back to Job. And as we started chapter 38 last week, we saw how the Lord now speaks after Elihu is done with his rebuttal to Job. God steps up and he begins to speak to Job. And so God is not going to say, "Well, Job, let me see your argument, present it again so I can get a good understanding." God knows. God knew it all beforehand. God has heard the words of Job. He's heard the words of the friends. And so there's no need for a rehash of all of that. It's God's turn. And now he's going to step up and he's going to present his case. And as he does so, as we saw last week, just a little bit of review, as we saw last week in the first part of chapter 38, the Lord pretty much steps down on Job pretty hard. He says in verse 2, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" So, Job, you don't know what you're talking about. And who are you to do this? Then end of verse 3, "And I will ask you and you instruct me." Now, can you imagine that? Me instructing God. So God is being a bit sarcastic here to Job. He is pointing out the obvious. You don't know what you're talking about. So if you want to instruct me, go ahead, but you're way out of your league here. He moves on too, and he says in verse 5, something about who said its measurements, since you know. And this is a phrase he uses pretty regularly throughout this conversation. He says, for example, in verse 18, he says to Job, he says, "Have you understood the expanse of the earth? Tell me if you know this." So he is saying pretty much the same thing there. Over in verse 21, he says, "You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great." He really is poking fun at Job. Job doesn't know these things, but God is pointing out the fact that he doesn't. Chapter 40 and verse 2, a little later on, the Lord says it again pretty much. He says in this verse 2, he says to Job, he says, "Look, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it." So again, he's saying the same basic thing. Job, you're calling me out. You're saying I don't know what I'm talking about. You're the one that does not know what you're talking about. Then the Lord moves on. This is where we're going to go the rest of the week. The Lord moves on to show that he certainly does know what he's talking about, and he's certainly in charge of all things. So it's going to be a joy for us to slowly work through some of the things that God says about his own greatness and the things that Job apparently doesn't understand, and maybe we don't either. We'll see. See you tomorrow.